And I hope Uri can turn on the camera and join us.
Yeah, so I would suggest, Gabi, that you'll take it on. I'm trying to get some assistance here, and hopefully I'll be able to join you on camera.
Excellent.
Okay?
Excellent. Right. Well, Professor Yehudai, first of all, thank you so much to you, to Ms. Lori Fireman, and to everybody else who has been involved in making this possible. Is it okay? Shall I continue, or should we?
It's okay now, right? Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, go. Yeah, go on.
You have to mute your mic. That's it.
It's okay? Okay, now you're on mute, so I can't hear you. So if there's anything, you can just go like this. And that way I'll know to stop talking. So thank you so much to you, Professor Yehudai, and to the team, to so many individuals who made this event possible. It is so nice because the edited volume came out right in the midst of the COVID storm, and we haven't really had a chance to talk about it. So it's just much appreciated event that I'm very, very honored to participate in. So I'll very quickly talk about my project. My project, or rather the chapter in the book, is basically an offshoot of my PhD, my doctoral research that I did at McGill University here in Montreal, particularly looking at race and racism and Blackness as it pertains to the experience of Ethiopian Jewish Israelis. So the fieldwork was done at this point. It's been 10 years. It's been over 10 years, actually. But the conversation and my interest in race and racism as it pertains to Ethiopian Israelis has not stopped. And essentially, I'm very interested at that intersection between this diaspora identity, in particular Jewish diaspora identities, and Blackness, and how those two intersect and are created and recreated, not only specifically as it pertains to Ethiopian Jews, but as many of the volumes, the chapters of the book show, it's also been recreated and adapted and adopted by many other groups, Jewish groups across history, and also more recently. So what led me to write a book on this topic? Well, essentially, my dear friend and Uri's PhD advisor, Fran Markowitz, who introduced us, Uri and I, to each other when I was doing my fieldwork in Israel. And we just noticed an important conversation that was yet to be had about Blackness and race in Israel in a way that was not yet being spoken. It didn't neatly fit into Black studies. It didn't neatly fit into Jewish studies. We're kind of like hovering all over the place. And so at one point, when both of us had graduated and finished, we decided that it was time to start this conversation about race and Blackness in Israel. I believe Uri is there. Oh, yes, he's connecting to audio. I'll let him take over now.
Uri, can you join us now? You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Almost.
So I think we will turn to the next question, and maybe Uri will be able to join us for the next question. Let us know if you're able to deal with this technical issue. So Gabriella, let's start with to get a little bit more deeper into the questions that you explore in the book, and we can start with a more general question. So can you talk a little bit about the role of race in Israeli life? To what extent do you think race and color determine social and political realities in Israel?
Okay, well, let me begin by by your first question, the role of race in Israel. I think race plays, it's almost like it's almost like a Janus-faced process, I feel, race in Israel, in the sense that so many of the raison d'être, the actual reason why Israel exists as a country, is in many ways a product of the extremely, violent ways that race can be conceptualized and then put to action, right? Obviously, here I'm referring to the Shoah, and even though, of course, so the concept of race has had a really, really clear role in establishing, in many ways, what we know today as Israel. And
Sorry, Gabi, can you hear me now, Ori?
yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
All right, thanks. Sorry for interrupt. Keep on, Gabi.
No problem at all. So I'm happy to hear your voice. And so, and as the state of Israel has progressed and developed and moved a long time and in history, we see that the role of race has changed in many ways, but it is nevertheless visible and invisible. It's visible, particularly as it pertains to what are known as visible minorities, such as racialized individuals, but it is also very much also at the root of the way that the state of Israel understands and legalizes and who actually belongs to the Jewish state and who does not, right? So who has the right to get Israeli citizenship and who does not. So even though there is no mention of the word race in and of itself, we see that race functions in many ways, in very quiet ways, alongside with the very louder ways, if you will, in terms of just actually looking at someone's, skin tone and physical features and all that it implies. I think I'm going to let Uri take over. We haven't heard his voice so far. Please jump on the wagon.
Okay,
Yes,
so
so you can join us at this point and also comment on the question of why, of the role of race in Israeli life.
mm-hmm. So I think this is definitely the ultimate question, because blackness is not a notion or a term that is very often spoken about in Israel. If you talk to the average Israeli about blackness, there's a good chance that he or she would not necessarily understand what we mean. As Israelis, again, generally speaking, do not think about themselves, about their neighbors, and about the society they live in terms of racial divisions, let alone about color lines. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that whereas in the States and other places as well, blackness seemed to be to speak for itself in a way, to be self-evident. You don't have to explain the term. You don't have to explain whom it referred to. In Israel, it's not that clear. And I will, with your permission, I will take it just one step backward to your opening question as to the structure of the book. So what we try to do in the way we edited the book is we're trying to stretch, so to speak, the term of blackness to its full capacity, to explore its full potential, and try to explore how it may or may not be applied to not only the obvious, I would say, addressees, people from African descent, whether they are Jews or not, but also other segments in Israeli society. And I think if to take just one example, I would refer to the chapter contributed by sociologist Nissim Leon, whose title, A Different View of Blackness, referring to the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, not a population or a social segment that would usually be referred to as Black people, and yet they are very vividly, visually black. I mean, they stand out for their blackness in the Israeli environment, and they are also referred to and called blacks. So whereas in the States, an encounter or a clash between, say, African American and ultra-Orthodox would be an encounter between blacks and Jews, here we, as I said, we tried to stretch blackness and see to take it to its full potential in a way.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So, so we'll get to a more specific discussion of the actual groups in Israel that use the language and concept of blackness. But I want to ask you another question about the theoretical approach in your theoretical approach in that book, the conceptual framework that you use in the book, and specifically to reflect about the process of applying ideas from Black studies to the study of Israel. So can you share with us some of your thoughts about the differences and similarities between common concepts of blackness in the more established or traditional field of Black studies on the one hand, and blackness in Israel on the other? Gabriella, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
So, applying the term of blackness to Israeli society and Israeli affairs, it's not something that is very, I would say, it's not something that you could take for granted, as I said, because blackness is not usually used in the Israeli discourse. The mainstream, so to speak, in Black studies is the one that follow the line of the Middle Passage, slavery, Jim Crow, and Black Power movement. So this would be the main matrix, I would say, from which Black studies was developed. And still the American context, as we know it, dominate the field for two reasons. I would say for two complementary moves, like a scissor-like move. On the one hand, the prominence of popular Black culture as produced and disseminated from the States to the rest of the world, and the scholarship of Black studies that raised in that is associated with it. Another, I would say, prominent axis is the one that runs from the Caribbean to the UK, but still, though it is posited in a somewhat different context, it falls rather comfortably within this matrix I just mentioned. Black studies produced in Latin America somewhat challenges this narrative, but since it rests yet on the seminal experience of slave ships and so forth, this challenge is not going far enough, in our opinion. Israel and what's going on in Israel and the effort to apply the notion of blackness into Israeli society is concerned more with what scholar Michelle Wright of where is she from? I don't remember. Well, she defined this contemporary Black studies in terms of post-Newtonian Black studies, in the sense that Black studies today does not necessarily gravitate back to this narrative and to this seminal experience of the Middle Passage and slavery and so forth, because today and from I would say, the late 20th century and early 21st century, Black communities are going from many different places toward many different places in many different circumstances, So it's kind of rhizomatic movement that go simultaneously in many different directions. And it's, in a way, it lacks any sense of shared mythology. In a way, it blurs the distinction between homeland and diaspora, between centers of Black culture and peripheries, and so forth. And Israel and the way we approach Blackness in the Israeli context and took it to many different directions is, I think, is a good manifestation of this contemporary trend in Black studies.
If I may, do I have time to add to that? Yes. I just wanted to add also to that, that, you know, as Uri mentioned, Black studies has been very much anchored within the narrative and, of course, the experience of the slave trade of the Middle Passage. One thing we wanted to do with this book is to give enough evidence that we need to rethink, or at least expand, what we understand by Black and Blackness. And therefore, we need to rethink the ways we can theorize and conceptualize Blackness in cases, and there are multiple cases of Blackness that is divorced or very separated from, geographically, historically, from the experience of the Middle Passage. So how do we, in what theoretical framework can we think of Hasidic Jews, for example, or Orthodox Jews as Blacks, right? So the actual theoretical framework that we have now doesn't allow us to do that. How can we think about, for example, you know, in the Caucasus, you know, the little region of the world, often people from the Caucasus who move to Russia are considered Black. So, for example, Armenians from Armenia who live in Russia are actually called Black, and I myself am Armenian. So, as you can see, that I am not very dark in terms of skin tone. So, how do we think of Black studies and Blackness in a way that actually encompasses these different kinds of Blacknesses that are very much removed from the slavery and the Middle Passage? So that's the conversation, I think, essentially, that this book has started. One that we both think is very important, particularly as it pertains to expanding that theoretical framework so as to include different experiences of Blackness that run parallel to, right? They're not exactly like the experiences that stem from the Middle Passage, but that run parallel to that narrative and that experience.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Both of you, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So indeed, I think to better understand those issues, we have to start on maybe a more specific discussion about the various groups in Israel that actually use the concept and language of Blackness as part of their struggles and experiences in Israel. So I want to ask you to take some time and talk about those groups. I'm specifically thinking about Palestinians, about Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, or Mizrahi Jews or Mizrahim, Ethiopian Jews, and labor migrants and asylum seekers in Israel from Africa. So please talk about those different groups and how they relate to the concept of Blackness.
Just in terms of short intro, I think that will use as a segue into a specific discussion about specific groups. I'd just like to add that what makes this interesting is the fact that none of these groups, maybe aside of the specific case of the Black Hebrews, are not usually often considered or considered themselves necessarily as Blacks. In that regard, I want to tease out and mention the chapters contributed by Fran Markovits, whom Gabriella already mentioned, studied the Black Hebrews. The Black Hebrews, for those who may not know, is the African-American group who immigrated to Israel since the 1960s. They were graduated from the hotbed of the Black Power movements, and realizing or considering themselves as descendants of the ancient Israelites, they consider their move or the migration from the States to Israel in terms of homecoming. And since they came from Chicago and refer to themselves as African Americans or as Blacks, they are the only group who may be referred to, as friend Markovits titled her chapter, as already Black. All the rest of the people are just exploring their sense of Blackness, trying to figure out whether or not they are actually Black, trying to embrace Blackness or otherwise reject it or share Blackness, or trying to figure out what Blackness may mean to them. So everybody is just going around this notion, trying to figure out what it means. The only group that is by definition already Black was that of the Black Hebrew Israelite community.
If I may add to that, Uri, it's interesting what you said about exploring sense of Blackness and kind of engaging in different racial tropes in terms of positioning the collective identity of one's group. If I refer, for example, to Ethiopian Jewish Israelis, that exploration of their sense of Blackness was very much imposed upon them, in the sense that, it's not out of choice that they're exploring their sense of Blackness, but it's out of necessity in terms of having to come to terms with being this, now it's been multiple decades since their aliyah, since they moved to Israel. However, initially, and of course to this day, we know that there are still issues, but initially this kind of, these Black African bodies present in Israel in the 1970s and the 1980s really was like in opposition to all the other Jewish ethnic groups that were already there, who weren't as dark in terms of skin tone, who weren't as non-Westernized at that point, of course, compared to other Israeli groups. But even if I think of the Mizrahi, even people who are Mizrahi, who are not in the American, Canadian, Eurocentric sense Black, right? They're not considered Black. So if you see somebody who looks Lebanese or Armenian or anything else like Moroccan or whatever, we don't associate them with Blackness. But in the Israeli setting, politically and for many other reasons, they mobilized themselves around this concept of Blackness because they were imprinted the identity of Blackness and the status of being the Blacks of Israel before the Ethiopian Jewish arrives. So there is an exploration, but there's also a necessity for some groups, like, and I would add the Palestinians in this too. I don't know what you would say to that, Uri. Definitely the Palestinian the youth, who particularly those who are involved in hip hop culture, have mobilized themselves around this concept of Blackness. And then we see here a really, really interesting, I wouldn't say a competition, but like a kind of like, well, who are the real Blacks in Israel, right? Who are the real Blacks in terms of a status, in terms of those who are mistreated, disenfranchised, marginalized, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think what makes this the whole issue very, very, very interesting is that in terms of, I would say, somatic properties, physical properties, there are very few Israelis you can easily refer to as actually Black people. I mean, when Palestinians or Mizrahi or others refer to themselves or embrace Blackness, it does not actually make them look more dark than what they actually are. And the experience in Israel is that you cannot easily define, say, Palestinian from a Jew. You cannot very easily define or tell Ashkenazi from Mizrahi, especially these days when intermarriages is very common and most of the Jewish Israelis are mixed one way or another. You cannot tell Jewish Ethiopian from an Eritrean or Sudanian asylum seeker. So when people play with the option of blackness, it's much more about discourse and performance, I would say, than something that, again, speaks for itself. It's rarely something that is self-evident. People have to give various manifestations of their supposed blackness, I would say, and this makes it so interesting because they have to bring it to the public sphere. They have to discuss it. They have to make a claim. They have to explain. They have to interpret, because blackness is not just out there.
Uri, I don't know if you would call that, I mean, and you mentioned the word too, performative blackness. There is definitely an individual's work, right, involved in adopting these kinds of references of blackness for people who are not somatically speaking, visibly from the sub-Saharan part of Africa. And the performative blackness is constantly in dialogue with groups who are forced, right, or who have to contend with a blackness by virtue of just being present in a society where most people don't look like they come from sub-Saharan Africa.
Uri, you wanted to comment?
Yes, I totally agree. I totally agree. So what we're actually talking about here, and we dedicated a whole section in our book to what we entitled contested blackness, and where we focused on different interactions or meeting points between different groups that's claiming their blackness or trying to impose blackness on others. So as you realize, always brings us back to the book. One way to give some credit to our great contributors. So one relevant chapter in that respect is the study by Avihu Shoshana, study the meeting between Ethiopians and Mizrahi students in a boarding school. And his title, a very clever one, is "I am blacker than you," which is a quotation of a sentence that Ethiopian student tell to his classmate, Mizrahi classmate. But I think if we learn something from this book, is that we're not speaking about this same old thing called blackness, or if we deny at the first place the option that blackness is a thing, an object, something that, again, as I said, self-evident, then we must conclude or at least deliberate the option that we're not speaking about different perceptions or different manifestations of the same thing, but actually what we're talking about is different things or different blacknesses, so to speak. So in that regard, it is not that Ethiopians are blacker than Mizrahis. They are just blacks in a different way. You cannot, it's not that you could put a blackness on a certain scale and then see who is blacker than who. But we must understand it as a blackness that exists on different levels or different scales. That I wouldn't say totally independent of one another, because they come into interaction with one another, into negotiation with one another, but yet they are in a way partly independent.
May I add something to that, Professor Yehudai? Yeah. So in that diversity of blacknesses that you just mentioned, Uri, the interesting thing, I think, is that there is a thread, right? A common thread. And that the idea of whether it's performative Blackness or Blackness as per, you know, your somatic appearance, there is a sense of marginalization. There is a sense of being very different from the most other people in society. And there is a sense of being, to some extent, disempowered or living and being in a position of disempowerment. Now, as Ori mentioned, not all of these are the same for every group. It's important to ask questions like, what are the factors that are causing group X or Y to be marginalized and or to feel marginalized? What are the consequences of these marginalization, of this marginalization, of these you know, disenfranchisement? It is not the same cost, if you will, of comparing, let's say, if I were to compare Palestinians living in Israel versus Ethiopian Jews, Israelis living in Israel versus, you know, an Ashkenazi who's a Jewish person who's just really, really into hip hop music and who adheres and has internalized this idea of Blackness, performative Blackness, for a variety of reasons, right? So there are different consequences and different costs. I don't know, would you use that word, Uri, to speak of Blackness as well in terms of what it represents for consequences of marginalization and potential disenfranchisement? I don't know if you would agree with that, Uri.
If I'm not sure I understood which, if I use which.
So the cost of Blackness is not the same for all different. Yeah.
The cost of Blackness. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to you to offer or to suggest that the fact of being that skin tone does not play a role. Of course, it's it is out there. It's something that people see and refer to. So being dark or being black does have its consequences. Yeah, I mean, definitely. But yet I think we wouldn't like to reduce Blackness to either to any of these properties, even not to the question of marginalization and disenfranchisement, because some groups who claim Blackness or enchanted by the option of Blackness are not necessarily marginal ones. Even marginalization is relative, I say. And here, let me bring the last section in our book. Take the notion of Blackness into the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Michael Fischbach, historian Michael Fischbach, speaks about the historical affiliation or solidarity between African-American activists since the 60s, the Black Panther, the Nation of Islam, of course, and the Palestinian struggle, and its contemporary offshoots and its affiliation with the BDS and so forth. And the conventional or the regular narrative goes on and says that Israeli Jews and Zionism is actually a colonial endeavor, and Jews are representative of the European white Western civilization amidst the Middle East, toward which Jews of Ashkenazi background in America refer and said, and let me quote. If can we do we have the time for that, Ori, to have a citation from?
Yeah, you could give us the quote, and then we'll open up the floor for questions.
Okay, so Michael Fischbach quotes W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote in 1973 that in the Middle East it is colored folk battling with the white folk of Israel, surrounded as they are by an ocean of Stanton people, Israel repeatedly, defiantly, and arrogantly asserted its superior whiteness. Nobody was allowed to forget that the state of Israel belonged to the dominant, enlightened white world. Now, Jewish American activists answers to that, saying, and I'm quote again, "We Ashkenazic Jews are Middle Eastern, and thus we are not white. The Ashkenazic Jews who call themselves white Jews have not acknowledged our Middle Eastern ancestry or do not want to." So this person went on to urge them to purge themselves, Jewish, Ashkenazi Jews and others, to say we Ashkenazi Jews need to decolonize our minds and return to our Middle Eastern roots in the land of Israel. Okay, so in that regard, and of course we can argue with that, but the claim is that being a Jew, being from Jewish ancestry, posits you by definition as non-white, which was actually true for many years in the American context, right? Until Jews have successfully became white folks in America.
Yeah, thank you. So I do have more questions that I want to ask you, but I think at this point we can turn to questions from the audience. We'll start from audience in the room. So if you have a question that you want to ask our speakers, please.
I was wondering what.
Can you hear? Sir? Yeah.
I was wondering what the largest or most common criticism was you got from your book.
That's a great question.
Wow.
Uri, do you have the answer to that one? Because I actually don't.
Well, I have. We didn't get any, so to speak, official criticism yet, or at least not the one that I encountered. But yet, what's comes up every time is actually the discussion that we are maintaining in the last 15 minutes or so, whether we have the privilege just to refer to Blackness as a floating signifier, so to speak, and anyone can claim to be Black, is it something that privileged group, for them is just entertainment, where for others it's everyday reality that puts them, as Gabby said, in a marginal position and doom them for continual struggle. So yeah, I think by trying to apply and, as I said, stretch Blackness into new horizons, this would be perhaps the weakest point. Here we are opening ourselves to criticism, and I understand it and I accept this kind of criticism, but yet I think it makes this book much more interesting, at least for me, to explore these options.
Gabriella, do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely. I think actually, and to echo you, Uri, I myself have also not heard of any major, I haven't really heard much about criticisms concerning the book. It's important to note that unfortunately came out in the crappy beginnings of COVID. And so it definitely hasn't had the exposure that we both had anticipated it would. So this is why we much appreciate this opportunity to speak with and discuss with all of you. But I think for me personally, there's a very thin line here ethically in terms of writing, and I'm talking about myself. I don't want to talk, in Uri's name or any of the other contributors' name, but for me personally, as an individual who's, very conscious about social justice issues, a range of them rather, there is this ethical questioning of how do I write about Blackness? How do I write about the experience of Ethiopian Jewish Blackness in a way that is respectful of their lived experiences, which are not always positive, as we all know, and yet still speak as an anthropologist, even though I myself am not Black per se, right? And I'm not saying here that I have to be Black in order to write about Ethiopian Jews. I'm not saying that you have to be Black in order to write about Blackness. I think it's actually, we're opening this discussion in terms of like, let's look at the different inflections of Blackness, ranging from the, I would call it the kind of the hardcore, like by your mere presence, you're automatically, racially profiled, or so there's like a very direct daily microaggressions that you have to live with, to the more performative, discursive aspect of Blackness. So that's the conversation I want to have. But ethically, that's definitely something that, critics could bring up in terms of speaking about Blackness. So that's something that I kind of think about quite regularly, even though honestly, so far, I haven't heard any criticisms really. And I'm almost afraid to, what's going to come after this conversation, after having said that we haven't really, met with much criticism yet.
Okay, thank you. So let's take more questions here in the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to ask about another discursive category, which is whiteness. Is that also in circulation in Israeli society? Because in some other Middle Eastern contexts, whiteness is, just like you described as a relational category, is much more in circulation. In Turkish, for example, there is no term for Black Turk, but there is a term for white Turk, which implies upper middle class, upper class sections, privileged sections of society, which are distant from the rest of it. Or in Kurdish, for example, there is no such a term as Black Kurd, but there's a term for white Kurd, who are implying people pejoratively, implying people who've grown up in assimilated to the rest of the Turkish society, do not speak Kurdish. So is there, what can we say about the discursive category, whiteness as a discursive category?
Yeah, good question. So I'll begin by repeating the point I've made in the opening of my words, that racial categorization is not common trope in Israel. Unlike the States, where on a mundane situation, when you have to fill out certain forms or apply for a job, you have to refer to yourself through racial categorization, how you write, how you categorize yourself. Although these days you have the option just to ignore it, but still, the very fact that people are asked to refer to themselves in terms of racial affiliation just denotes the fact that racial thinking is a matter of common sense in the States and of course in other places. It is not in Israel. People make this division along religious or ethnicity or nationality and so forth. So when people deliver or mobilize the discourse of Blackness, they are making a claim. They bringing something that is uncommon, something that is pregnant with meanings, and as they do, they also denote those who are they denote whiteness as well. By referring, say, to themselves as Blacks, they obviously points to others as whites, and usually in the context of being with a privileged position. Yes, it become more and more common, for example, to speak about Ashkenazi people within the current discourse of identity politics, to speak about the Ashkenazi people in terms of the white tribe. It become as I say, as blackness become more and more common in the discourse, so do whiteness, either explicitly or not.
If I may add to that, so whiteness in Israel is an extremely complex phenomenon. And it is, you know, as Uri mentioned, by virtue of speaking of blackness or claiming Black identity, we are claiming that within the context of its opposite, which is white and whiteness. But claiming and calling yourself white in Israel, and, you know, I'm not the Israeli out of the two editors, so please correct me if I'm wrong. I have yet to hear somebody call themselves or call somebody else white, unless they themselves have been racialized as Black, okay? So it's not, once again, it's very, very different than the way that our society is here in North America is organized. Our society is very much organized across the color line, whereas the main vector for organizing and understanding and categorizing people in Israel is really religion. I would say religion and ethnicity, like Uri mentioned. Professor Yehudai, I don't know if I have a chance to just address somebody in the chat. They said, they mentioned something about being concerned in terms of, you know, if blackness is a color, if blackness being a color and not a race. If I may clarify something about our approach to race is, you know, we spoke about somatic features like darker skin tone and so on, but we did not say
Gabriella, sorry, maybe you could just clarify what you're responding to, the comment you're responding to.
Oh, I apologize. So it's by, it says, so it's by Charlotta B. Tavares. I'm concerned this individual writes that we are confusing, quote, blackness state of mind versus heritage and common ancestry of African descent. Black is a color and not a race. So I just want to specify what do we understand and what we, you know, speak of when we speak about race, particularly from our vantage point. So we are not speaking of race, of blackness in terms of a race. There are phenotypical features that have been socially constructed into the color-coded word Black, right? So when we're using the word Black and when we're speaking about people who are phenotypically lighter or darker skin toned, we are not saying that we believe that being Black is about a race, because biologically, once again, we know, right? We know that biologically, if we look at the genetic components of our makeup of individuals, what we would consider racial traits occupy something like 0.03% of our genetic makeup. So when we speak about blackness, we don't mean in terms of biology and race, right? We don't think that blackness is about race. It is about a social construction of an identity that takes root, you know, starting from the 15th, 16th centuries in terms of the European understandings and conceptualizations of race. But then these understandings have a plateau, right? They reach a point where they almost become embedded and embodied by the individuals to whom we attribute blackness. So I just wanted to clarify that we are not saying that being Black is about race per se.
Thank you. Are there more questions here in the room before we can turn to some questions from the chat box? Questions or comments? No. So let me turn to a question from Nomi Brenner. She thanks you for the wonderful conversation, and she asks you if you could expand on discourses or performances of blackness in recent years as compared to 10 or 20 years ago. How might they be changing, given changing discourses in the US or elsewhere? Question about change over time in expressions and process of blackness.
Well, I don't feel comfortable enough to speak about the recent trends in Black studies as it's concerned to the American society. But I would say that in the Israeli context, I mean, like many other terms that used to be a taboo for many, many years, the discourse of blackness, or more generally, discourse that uses terms related to racial categories, are become more and more audible, more and more in everyday discourse, in the media, in the politics, and so forth. So if I would say 30 years ago, to call someone black or to say about yourself, to refer to yourself as black would be a shocking gesture. I mean, it's something that's, when in 1953, as far as I know, it was the first time that someone used the term black in public discourse. It was in a very popular journal that was published in Israel back then, Ha'olam Hazeh, this world it called, and it was maybe the first time that the Israeli media referred to the discrimination against Mizrahi newcomers, and the cover story featured the shocking title, Dofkim et HaShorim, literally screwing the blacks. But it was so effective because it was like a bomb thrown into this apparently sterile environment where racial discourse or discourse related to colors were strictly taboo, whereas today it's very common. So in accordance, it becomes less and less, I would say, effective. It's just another gesture. You can be whatever you like to be these days, and just change costumes and so forth, identities as they pass. So you can be either try on blackness for certain periods, for certain reasons, for certain interests, and so forth.
I would actually just go, to reinforce what you just said. So when I read the question, can you expand on discourses or performances of blackness in recent years? My first question would be not only blackness when, but blackness where, right? So if one thing that is very, very clear that comes through in this book is how ideas of blackness and racialization are very much context specific. So it's not only about blackness being one thing and it's one thing that changes across time, but it's also about blackness being very, very context specific, even though, of course, it has some other, vector that allows it to connect to other, performances and of blackness elsewhere and at other points in time.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to ask you to respond to another question from the chat box. Question from Michael Robert Flam, who wants to know if Black Jews in Israel just call themselves Jews or Israelis or some other classification.
Gabi?
Well, I guess the first thing I would note is that, and Uri, please correct me, the idea of, once again, the question itself points to a kind of reality that doesn't exist in Israel, in that the main point of division is not Black versus white. It's really religious and ethnic, first religion and then ethnic, right? Ethnicity based on ethnic identity. So when I think of Blacks in Israel, I think of Ethiopian Jews who call themselves Black, Shorim, the Blacks, and who have other individuals who call them Etiopim or Hashchorim. But to my knowledge, other groups don't necessarily call themselves Blacks, except for maybe any jokes or certain anecdotes. But as a group, there isn't a group that's like the Blacks in Israel, as opposed to, let's say, the whites. And that's kind of the conversation we're having, is that it is far more complex than having some group called the Blacks. But in terms of the Ethiopian Jews, I can definitely tell you that they consider themselves 100% Jewish. They consider themselves 100% Israeli, and they will call themselves Ethiopian Israelis. They'll call themselves Israelis. They'll call themselves and identify to that as much as they would to identifications of, you know, the racialized identity of Black.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and I totally agree with what Gabi just said. I would say that by referring to themselves as Israelis and Jews as a default option is one way to downplay their color, not to make Blackness an issue. Yes, we are Blacks. Yes, we're African, but yet we're first and foremost Israelis and Jews.
We have another question or comment from the room. I'm gonna step here so you can see.
My name is Michal Vera. I'm Ethiopian Jew, live here in Columbus. First, we are Ethiopian Israeli Jew, Beta Israel. First, we used to call us Beta Israel. And for me, it's really interesting to hear from both of you a different perspective, and to talk about, as a white Jew, to talk about Blackness without having another Black person speaking about the feeling about Gabriella, your comment that the ethics comment you talked about, I really agree with you that it's hard to hear from white Jew talking about Black people about toned skin, and I felt here kind of to be Black, it's not blaming, it's not punishment, it's tone skin, and there is identity, there is culture, that when we talk about Israeli society, there is a lot of discrimination, racism, that because of our skin color, been discriminated for many years. This is the first thing when you are in an Israeli society. There is something that began, as you told, that with Moroccan Jew, but this is something that I felt really this discrimination affecting in our life, how we be integrate, or how being accepted as one of the Israeli society in many ways. It's a fact in education, it's how the police brutalities, how it's the life and which neighborhoods in the area we live. And I think it's shift now because we are young generation, young leaders, saying the story of the Ethiopian Jew in our voice, not my parents' generation that walked from Ethiopia to Sudan and came to different operation. This is really totally different. Now we are demanding our rights, we are fighting, we are discriminating, we are really saying that the perspective would have to be changed, how the Israeli society skin us, or see us, or observe us as a part of the Israeli society.
Thank you so much for that.
So Michal brought up several issues. Do you want to respond?
If I may go ahead.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for that intervention. Thank you so much for your comments. I much appreciate it. So, you know, when I'm speaking as a scholar, right, as a non-Ethiopian, clearly non-Black scholar, about, you know, the experience of Ethiopian Jews in Israel, I make it a point not to speak for them, right? I'm not a representative of the community just because I was, you know, granted, you know, access and had the opportunity to live with and speak to and have discussions with and create beautiful friendships with members of the Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel. That does not give me the right to speak for them. But I can, with my with the step back that I have by virtue of not being Ethiopian or Jewish or Israeli or any of those, I can nevertheless have a little bit of an input in what you're, if I may, if I can add to what you're saying. So, you know, I like to use Goffman's idea or concept of stigma. And of course, Blackness and being Ethiopian is not only a stigma. It's not only a bad thing. Of course, there is culture, there is beauty, there is change, there's mobilization. I mean, anybody who knows anything about Ethiopian culture cannot contest, right? Cannot even potentially say that there isn't something that's extremely rich and unique, which is also the case for every culture. But in Israel, the discrimination faced by Ethiopian Israeli Jews is kind of represented, right, by this umbrella indicator of their dark skin tone and quote unquote skin color and being Black. But Goffman, if we look at the idea that Goffman is talking about, it's not so much about the content as it is about the relationship. And what I mean by that is that race never works alone, right? Blackness never works alone. The specific ideas and negative stereotypes that have been associated with Ethiopian Israeli Jews are also have to do with the level of education when the first cohort of Ethiopian Jews came, their level of knowledge of westernization, of technology, and this and that. And of course, there were many among that cohort that were educated, but there were also a very large proportion that came from rural backgrounds, completely different reality to what exists in Israel. So the kind of specific racism that Ethiopian Jews face in Israel is, of course, spearheaded and made very obvious by virtue of being Black, right? I mean, we've all seen, or if you haven't, you know, do look at that. There's a horrible video that went so viral not too long ago. Well, actually, it's been a while now, of that Ethiopian Israeli soldier getting assaulted by a police officer. So these kinds of very realistic aggressions do happen. And it's important, however, myself as a non-Black, non-Ethiopian scholar to kind of unpack this in a way that actually allows that distance for me. And so in that sense, my ethical issue is not so much, do I do research on people I don't look like, or do I do research on a group that I am not a part of? My answer is yes. But the question is how I do that research and how I write about it. That's where the ethics come in. How do I write about them?
Just with I see that we're running out of time. Just
Yeah,
with
so
a closing sentence to add to what Gabi is saying. About the fact that two non-Black scholars writing book about Blackness in Israel. So I do aware of of Blackness being a lived experience, being something that have very tangible aspects. Yet for us, and I'm not trying to be impolite or insensitive. As scholars, we approach Blackness first and foremost as a theoretical term. And it is our responsibility and duty to explore the different possibilities of Blackness without downplaying, without ignoring the real negative aspects of actually being Black. Okay, so in that respect, I take this prerogative to speak about Blackness, and as Gabi said, not to speak for Black people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to say about those questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So at this point, I want to thank our speakers, and I also want to thank the audience, both online and here in the room. And I also want to thank, of course, Tom and Diane Mann for their continued support of our programs. So thank you very much, and I hope the conversation will continue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.
This has been fantastic. Thank you to all the participants, to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you everyone for coming and participating.